Hello, today's talk is on new empires versus old empires in Europe. The 19th century in Europe was an unprecedented time of population growth and of industrialization. By the middle of the century, Europe was exporting people all over the world and sending explorers and modern conquistadors into territory Europeans had never been able to penetrate successfully. We need to understand what made this expansion possible, what made it desirable, and how the new colonies taken by European nations between 1830 and 1930 differed from the colonies that they had founded from 1400 to 1800. The European quest for territory outside of Europe proper had a long history and included, for example, the period we refer to as the Crusades, with attempts to set up European states in the Levant and in North Africa. Outside of a few islands in the Mediterranean, those missions had eventually ended in failure. While they had stimulated European tastes for goods like sugar and silk, they had not resulted in any kind of European sovereignty outside of Europe. Instead, Europeans were able to set up trade networks on the permission of local rulers, such as Venetian trade missions in the Levant. This situation started to change at the beginning of the 15th century, as Portugal and Spain began setting up colonies in North Africa and on islands off the West African coast, and in the Atlantic. By 1500, Spain had begun to colonize the New World, and Portugal had sent ships all the way to India. The Portuguese quickly came to dominate the Indian Ocean and set up colonies in the Far East as well as in South America. This second big wave of European empires was much more enduring than the first. Spain eventually established colonies in North, Central, South America, and in East Asia. After 1600, France, Denmark, England, and the Netherlands set up colonies in the Americas as well. The Dutch competed with the Portuguese to set up colonies in the Far East. There were, in this colonial wave, three different kinds of colonies. What we could call settler colonies, where Europeans came in large numbers to settle, often wiping out the indigenous population through disease and massacre, setting up societies based on European norms and economies. We can call these neo-Europes. In these places, like in North America and eventually Australia and New Zealand and parts of South America, native populations were nearly or completely wiped out, and the land came under cultivation with European crops to export back to Europe. Trade colonies were a second type. In areas where there were developed states and no disease gradient or a technology gradient that favored the Europeans set up coastal trade forts, often on islands off the mainland, in order to get at goods that Europeans could not make for themselves. A great example of this happened in India, where Europeans struggled to keep a foothold before the 18th century, and above all in Central and Southern Africa, where Europeans could not venture far inland without catching tropical diseases and dying horribly. And of course, one of the major trade goods that they extracted from Africa in their coastal forts were human beings that they enslaved. Extraction colonies are a third type. In other parts of the world, notably the sugar islands of the Caribbean and islands off the coast of Western Africa, Europeans replaced the indigenous people with enslaved Africans, who were then put to work under awful conditions, growing crops that would not grow in Europe, but were in high demand there. These included coffee and sugar, dye plants, tobacco, and it also came to include tea, opiates, and rubber over the longer term. These colonies were ruled quite brutally and used coerced labor to plant, harvest, and process what we can call tropical crops. Historians argue that this first wave of empires ended sometime between 1775 and 1830. It was during this period, 1775 to 1830, that a variety of settler colonies broke free from their imperial rulers, with revolutions in American colonies, both North, Central, and South, resulting in a new group of republics. However, the second wave had already begun. A new wave had already begun with French and British expansion in India. This expansion into formerly strong states that had been able to resist European incursions didn't really take off until after 1830, when European conquerors divided most of the world between them, so that by the beginning of World War I, there were only a few independent countries left outside of Europe, including Ethiopia, the Kingdom of Siam, and Japan. What was specifically new about the creation of empires between 1830 and 1914? We'll say 5 things. First, and most importantly, the last great wave of imperialism took place as the Industrial Revolution spread throughout Europe. The world's economy was increasingly brought under the control of the centers of finance and industry in Europe. Colonies were sought, at least in part, to bring them into the orbit of European capitalism for the benefit of the conquering European powers. Newly created or unified countries in Europe acquired colonies for the first time. Belgium, which became a country in 1830, took the Congo in the heart of Africa. Italy and Germany, which were created in the middle of the 19th century, acquired territory in Africa as well. The United States took Hawaii, islands in the Pacific, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and more at the end of the 19th century. Even older powers were revitalized and sought more territory. Third, this race for land was triggered, at least in part, by insecurity. The nations involved sought to increase or protect their position in Europe and in the world by expanding their empires. Britain feared, for example, that Russia and the United States would overtake it as a great power. The French and Germans feared losing their dominant positions in European politics, and lesser powers, like the Netherlands, sought to become players on a global scale. This included Japan, which sought territorial concessions from China and Russia at the turn of the century and became the colonial power in what we know now as North and South Korea. Colonization had formerly been government policy. A fourth thing that changed was that in the latter half of the 19th century, pressure groups formed in each Western power which encouraged imperial expansion. Small but effective lobbies pushed governments to take steps which the governments did not necessarily see as prudent. These could happen for a variety of reasons, economic, ideological, religious. And finally, more land was occupied in this period than had been occupied in any of the previous imperial expansions, save the conquest of the New World. This led to the domination of the entire world, really, by one continent. In 1900, for example, Britain alone ruled 1/4 of the world by land area, or 1/3 by population count. Before the 19th century, Europeans had established military domination of the world's seas, from the Mediterranean to the coastal waters of China and Japan. They had not been able to establish domination in the interior of Asia or Africa to the same extent as they had done in the New World. Why not? A couple of reasons. First, in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa, there were strong states that had access to gunpowder technology, something that was absent in the New World. Europeans had an overwhelming advantage at sea militarily, but they did not have any particular military advantage on land. When Europeans fought non-Europeans in the Old World outside of Europe and away from coastal settlements, they were generally heavily outnumbered. Whatever victories they could win were temporary. Local forces were always able to regroup and undo European victories. Europeans had naval superiority but lacked any way to move their great ships up rivers, no matter how navigable. When fighting against states in India or Asia or Africa, Europeans ended up being stuck on the coast. Second, in tropical regions of the Old World, Europeans found themselves facing any number of diseases to which Europeans had no resistance, and this was true in the Levant as well. When attempting to explore Africa, for example, European survey parties tended to go up jungle rivers in good numbers and then not come back. Malaria, yellow fever, any number of tropical diseases devastated Europeans, and the local populations had developed over time some resistance to these diseases. So what changed in the 19th century that allowed the Europeans to project their power inland to make it possible for them to conquer most of the world? 3 things. First, the creation of steam power. Europeans developed around the turn of the 19th century steam locomotion. This was used on ships early in the 19th century much more successfully than on land, and by mid-century, European navies had steam vessels in use all over the world. These ships, when turned to military use, were able to tow heavily armed ships of the line, great ships with 60 or 100 or more guns up navigable rivers in China during the Opium Wars, and they were useful elsewhere too. The impressive power of European navies was able to suddenly dominate river networks as well as coasts. In addition, steam power made it possible for military or scientific parties to travel up rivers all throughout the world, taking Europeans further inland in Africa and in Asia than had ever been practical before. In fact, it's very much the invention of steam power and its deployment, for example, that makes the European opening up of Japan possible in the middle of the 19th century. Previously, the Japanese had been able to maintain river forts that stopped Europeans from penetrating inland. By the 1850s and 60s, the European ships were able to blast past those forts and dominate the interior. Second, advances in medicine. Being able to travel inland would have made little difference if those who made the journey simply died from disease. A second change was the development of medicine to treat and prevent tropical diseases, starting with anti-malarial drugs and moving on from there. While Europeans still died in large numbers when stationed in tropical outposts, they now survived in sufficient numbers to have a strong military presence. This made it possible for Europeans to invade countries and areas such as Cochin China, which was made up of territory that is now called Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and sub-Saharan Africa, where previous attempts at European penetration had ended up in complete wipeouts. A war to think about here is the attempt by Europeans to conquer Haiti, which had gone into revolution in the 1790s. When they arrived, they simply got tropical diseases in large numbers, and European armies rotted from tropical disease that the rebelling slaves were not subject to in such great numbers. And it made it impossible for Europeans to reconquer the territory called Haiti. Third, advances in weapons. Europeans made enormous improvements in weapons during the 19th century. To be honest, weapons had not changed in Europe in any major way between 1715 and 1815. And the weapons of 1715 were not that much better in truth than those of 1615. European armies used smooth-bore single-shot muskets, smooth-bore single-shot cannon, and wooden ships powered by sail. When Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors defeated Moctezuma in Mexico in the 1520s, they did it more by having recruited local allies and by having a disease gradient where Europeans spread diseases to which they were not subject, than by having steel weapons. And even then, they relied more on crossbows, cavalry, and pikes than they relied on cannon and muskets. The military gradient simply wasn't that great before the 19th century. Non-European nations in the Old World, China, Japan, India, and even African states all had access to and strong familiarity with gunpowder weapons. Europeans simply could not move enough troops to where the fighting was going to be to overcome local superiority in numbers, and they couldn't win with lower numbers because they didn't have spectacularly better weaponry or organization. After 1830, this began to change dramatically. Industrialization led to real improvements in weapons. By mid-century, the European armies were using rifles, and they were using rifled cannon, both of which had dramatically longer effective range than smoothbore weapons. Soon after this, Europeans developed breech-loading rifles and breech-loading cannon, which dramatically increased the rate of fire for European troops. This meant that by the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, small units of European troops could deploy as much firepower as much larger non-European armies and could be lethal at much longer ranges. Even when local forces could get their hands on more modern weapons, they were unable to manufacture them in numbers sufficient to defend their territory against small units of professional European soldiers supported by colonial auxiliaries. Where the Chinese, Indians, and Africans were able to make plenty of muskets and even smoothbore cannon, they were unable to manufacture large numbers of breech-loaders, and Europeans came to conspire not to sell arms to non-European states. By the 1870s and 1880s, Europeans had learned to always fight on the defensive, setting up strong points with rifles, cannon, machine guns. Europeans could hold out indefinitely against much larger armies armed with only smoothbore muskets, and they inflicted huge numbers of casualties. When their enemies retreated, European armies would advance and then once again take up defensive positions when assaulted. When European armies were caught in the open, they might be slaughtered, but in defensive positions they could scarcely be beaten. In the latter half of the 19th century, non-Europeans scored some victories, such as the annihilation of Custer's forces at Little Bighorn in 1876, the British defeat by Zulus at the Battle of Isandlwa in 1879, and the defeat of the Italian army at Adwa in 1896 by Ethiopian forces. In each case, though, the defeat was only temporary, and Europeans eventually conquered the American West, South Africa, and eventually Ethiopia. By 1914, Europeans and their descendants had conquered the globe. They had rendered all of the former great powers, India, China, powers of the Middle East, largely irrelevant. Faced with few challenges from abroad, they fell to squabbling among themselves with world historical consequences.